The time is 9 o'clock. There now follows a partly political broadcast by a person.
Good evening, 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 good evening.
The BBC are in trouble, in multiple senses. It no longer even seems ambiguous that their news department is supporting and promoting the Conservative government. I'm not one to go on about BBC bias, largely because in my lifetime I've seen it applied to almost anything and almost any ideology. In fact, BBC bias has been cited since before the BBC we know has even existed, when they were still the British Broadcasting Company, and the Labour Shadow Chancellor challenged them over their coverage of the general strike in 1926. Even then, the company, as was in much the same impossible position they've been in ever since. Effectively blackmailed by the government, Stanley Baldwin's Tories, who threatened to seize the company and convert it into a state broadcaster. And that was before they were the corporation we know today, with their public service remit and, more to the point, the decennial Charter Review hanging over their heads like the sword of Damocles, compelling them to stay on the good side of the government, whoever they happened to be at the time. They've been repeatedly punished for stepping out of line, particularly over the last 40 years, and by both Conservative and Labour governments. All the while, voices from both the left and the right have yelled about their being blatantly biased in the other side's favour the whole time. The current state of affairs is arguably the final flowering of John Birt's reforms of the 90s, in which he brought free market principles to the corporation, shattering its internal peace, pitting departments against each other in auctions for talent, and killing off the likes of the Radiophonic Workshop. It's in the last decade, or maybe just the last half-decade, that it's really become visible to the naked eye, particularly under Chris Patten, formerly the chairman of the BBC Trust and a veteran of the Conservative Party. It was during his tenure that the backrooms of the BBC became infused with explicit Tory supporters, just in time for the Conservatives to win a short-lived majority. You don't need me to tell you that the subsequent term, technically 2 terms of office, has been one of the most troubled in British history. And throughout that 4.5 years of decay, the BBC News Department has been engaged in some horrible dance of the 7 veils, gradually discarding any pretense of impartiality and becoming harder and harder for its die-hard supporters, like me, to defend. But even I can't deny it anymore. The BBC, or more specifically BBC News, has been distorted into Conservative Party propaganda, over and above their usual bias in favour of the government. It's long since past the point where Occam's razor buckles and snaps. Most of the rest of the media are pretty much doing the same things, but from the BBC, it particularly hurts. Especially if, like me, you are a passionate supporter and defender of the corporation. I sincerely believe the BBC, in its basic concept as a national public broadcaster, is almost as necessary as the NHS. Throughout this campaign, Labour supporters have been defending with strength and passion the idea of healthcare being free at the point of delivery, and quite rightly. But there's also a tendency, which is horrifying to me, for people on the same point in the ideological spectrum to dismiss the idea that the same should be true for art, entertainment, news and education, among other things. Of course, to make the argument that the BBC isn't worth saving, you had to start from a foundation of pure reductionism. The patently false first premise that the BBC's output consists of its increasingly disgraceful news provision, plus EastEnders, Strictly Come Dancing and Doctor Who, and nothing else. Not 9 television channels and another on the internet. Not 10 national radio stations and 40 local ones. Not the World Service or 13 international television channels. not its extensive online presence and services, not its support of new artists, writers and musicians, not pretty much the sole remaining dedicated service still creating and developing children's broadcasting in the country, and certainly not the friggin' proms. None of those things. Just whichever light entertainment formats the speaker doesn't like, and a fatally compromised news department. This level of dishonesty is necessary to justify the position of burning the BBC to the ground. Well, it's easy on this side of the fire to pretend you won't miss anything, or more accurately to pretend that the things you definitely will miss were never actually there to begin with. But you know better than that, or if you don't, you will, because once they're gone, you will notice their absence. The alternative to no BBC isn't no media, it's no non-corporate media. Rupert Murdoch might have relinquished Sky, but News Corp is still very much alive and broadcasting via its newspapers and talk radio, among other interests. It's not as if Comcast or Viacom, who own Channel 5, are really that much better. ITV still owns itself, mostly, but it could be taken over by anyone at any time. As indeed could Channel 4. A bid for the latter was in fact mulled over by Richard Desmond when he owned Channel 5. And Desmond, if you can imagine it, is actually worse than Murdoch. And this is the sole broadcast media we'd have left without the BBC. And again, I agree that the news department has reached a point of being unfit for purpose. The bathwater needs a change. But there's no need to do so at the expense of the baby, the bath, the bathroom, the entire house, the street, the town, and the entire society you're living in. This, I firmly believe, was part of the Conservative vision for the corporation, to turn the very people who should be its strongest supporters against it. Because make no mistake, if you're British and on the left, you should support BBC, in concept at least, just as strongly as you support the NHS. The NHS is socialised medicine. The BBC is socialised media, socialised culture. And it needs defending just as staunchly. Possibly more so because nationalised healthcare is an easier sell than nationalised television and radio. The BBC is in need of reform, and its news department in particular practically needs to be torn down and reconstructed from first principles. The operative word is reconstructed, not burned to the ground and destroyed. And, unsurprisingly, as with so many things, the Labour Party has a policy for that.
If we want an independent BBC, we should consider setting it free by placing it on a permanent statutory footing with a new independent body setting the licence fee. The licence fee itself is another potential...
Admittedly, they couldn't squeeze it into their manifesto in detail, but Jeremy Corbyn set out his plan for the corporation in last year's Alternative McTaggart lecture. Labour will free the BBC from government interference. It will be placed on a permanent statutory footing, with no need to renew the charter every 10 years. And this will remove that sort of Damocles from over the corporation's head and free it from needing to curry favour with the government, whoever the government are, lest they take the charter away. That charter will be revised and reformed along with the Freedom of Information Act to democratise the BBC, possibly to the extent that viewers will be empowered to elect new board members in place of the current system, which has 4 of them chosen by the Queen, which in practical terms means the government. The government will also no longer decide how much the licence fee should be, with all powers over it given over entirely to a new and entirely independent body. And the BBC will get extra funding from a corporate digital licence fee extracted from ISPs and tech giants. No government will be able to influence it to this extent again, even the notional Labour one under Corbyn. Instead, it will be made truly independent, answerable only to the viewers and listeners, as it should be. A true alternative to the corporate media, as it should be. A public service broadcaster truly for the people, as it should be. Alternatively, the Tories could get back in, strengthen their grip over it, and finally destroy it in spirit if not substance. This election is our last chance for a lot of things. It's the last chance to save the NHS from privatisation and colonisation, and it's the last chance to save the BBC from becoming Boris Johnson's own Ministry of Public Enlightenment. BBC News has become rotten, but don't let anyone tell you that it means the corporation's not worth saving. The truth is exactly the opposite. It makes saving it more urgent than ever. The only way to do that is to vote Labour, or failing that, vote for whoever defeats the right-wing candidate. Because the Tories will destroy the climate, the NHS and the BBC if you let them. And time is running out. Do or die, clang or chime. It's time to make the choice. You will not have a second chance. And you will not be forgiven.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening.
That was a partly political broadcast by a person